Every morning for the past 2 years, Harold had risen with the sun, though he hadn't truly slept. He'd sit at the kitchen table in his quiet little home on the outskirts of Bend, Oregon, cradling a cup of black coffee between his weathered hands. Outside the window, the sky would blush pink behind the pines. Inside his mind, it was anything but still. People often talk about silence as peaceful, but Harold had come to fear silence. It wasn't the absence of sound that unsettled him. It was the flood of thoughts that came rushing in the moment the world grew quiet. Memories, regrets, questions that had no answers. If only I had said more. If only I had listened better. If only I'd held her hand longer that night. His wife, Ellie, had passed away 2 years ago. And yet, most days, Harold felt as if she had only just left the room. The way grief lingered wasn't something anyone could prepare him for. It wasn't loud, it didn't shout. It whispered, over and over, through the corners of his mind. Then came the heart scare. It wasn't dramatic. No flashing lights, no ambulance, just a quiet pressure in his chest while folding laundry and a call to the doctor, just in case. The tests came back fine, mostly, but the doctor's words, gentle but firm, lodged themselves into Harold's thoughts like a new refrain. Your body is asking you to slow down, Harold. But more than that, your mind needs rest, too. Rest? Harold almost laughed. He was retired. He didn't work. He had no meetings, no deadlines, no children at home. What was left to slow down? But later that night, he sat up in bed, staring at the ceiling fan, and realized the truth. It wasn't about doing less. It was about feeling less trapped in his own head. That moment was the beginning. He wouldn't have called it a turning point then, just a pause. A long breath between what had been and what might come next. And it didn't begin with some grand revelation or mystical vision. It began with something much quieter. A question he'd never dared to ask. What if peace wasn't something you found, but something you made space for? This is the story of Harold's journey, not of healing in the way most people imagine it, not a return to what once was, but of discovering a gentler way to live with the noise inside his head. It's the story of learning not to fight every thought or fix every feeling, but to sit with them, to listen, and eventually to let them pass like leaves on a slow-moving stream. And if you've ever lain awake at night, wondering why your mind won't leave you be, if you've carried old hurts that still echo in the quiet, maybe Harold's story can offer you what it gave him. A way through. Stay with me. Let's walk this quiet path together. Part 1. I am not my thoughts. The morning after his doctor's visit, Harold sat out on the back porch, the same place where he and Ellie used to drink coffee together every Sunday. The chair beside him remained empty, untouched, but he still poured 2 cups out of habit. A light mist hovered over the lawn, clinging to the blades of grass like memory. He wrapped his hands around the warm mug and stared into the quiet, waiting for his mind to settle. It didn't. Thoughts came rushing in like they always did. Some were gentle, Recollections of Ellie's laugh, the way she used to hum while watering. The plants. Others were more cruel. Regret disguised as memory. Things he said or didn't say. The time he raised his voice over something so small he couldn't even remember what it was anymore. A question looped in his mind like a skipping record. Why do I keep thinking about this? Why can't I just let it go? He had read somewhere that the mind is like a river, always flowing. But Harold didn't feel like he was standing beside the river. He felt like he was being dragged down by the current. It wasn't until that morning, when a line from a book he had picked up at the library came back to him, that something shifted. You are not your thoughts. You are the one who sees them. It sounded simple, too simple, but it sat with him. He closed his eyes and tried something new. Instead of pushing the thoughts away or trying to change them, he just watched. He imagined himself sitting at the edge of a river, watching thoughts drift by like leaves. One leaf carried guilt, another longing, another fear. He didn't reach for them. He didn't judge them. He just noticed them. A strange calm settled over him, not because the thoughts disappeared, but because for the first time he wasn't inside them. He was watching them, and in that watching, something opened. A space. A breath. Harold realized then how much he had been identifying with every single thought that crossed his mind, as if each one defined him. He had believed that because a thought hurt, it must be true. Because it lingered, it must be important. But sitting there in the morning fog, a new truth emerged. Thoughts are like clouds in the sky. They come, they go, and none of them stay forever. They are not who we are. They are what passes through who we are. He took another sip of coffee. It had gone cold, but he didn't mind. For once the silence wasn't a threat. It was a shelter. He didn't feel healed. He didn't feel wise. But he felt something softer than he had in a long time, a little less like a prisoner inside his mind, and a little more like a witness. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward peace. Part 2. Cleaning the house. Inside. A few days after Harold's quiet morning on the porch, he found himself standing in the middle of his garage, surrounded by boxes that hadn't been touched in years. The plan was simple. Clean out the space, donate what he didn't need, maybe finally make room for the workbench he always told himself he'd build. But as he opened the first box, dust rising in the sunlight, something in him hesitated. The handwriting on the label was Ellie's. Neat, careful cursive. Christmas ornaments keep. He sat down on an old folding chair, the air thick with the scent of cedar, and something he couldn't name. Something like memory, maybe grief. He opened the box anyway. Inside were carefully wrapped ornaments, ribbons she had reused each year. Even a pair of tiny snowmen they had bought on their first Christmas together. For a moment, Harold just stared. Then he reached in and touched one of them, his fingers trembling. The ache that rose in his chest was deep, but not loud. It was a soft ache, the kind that hums under the surface, waiting to be felt. He hadn't meant to open anything that belonged to her, Not yet. But now that he had, there was no going back. That afternoon, Harold didn't just clean the garage. He moved through the house like a man walking through a memory. He opened closets, drawers, cabinets. Some items he kept. Ellie's old cardigan that still held her perfume. A photo album filled with faded prints. Others he let go. It wasn't a purge, and it wasn't dramatic. It was gentle, thoughtful. Each object held a question. Do I need this, or am I afraid to release it? Am I holding on to love, or am I holding on to pain? Later, as he sat in the living room, surrounded by empty boxes and half-packed donations, Harold noticed how different the space felt. Lighter, clearer. It wasn't just the physical clutter that had begun to shift. It was something within him. He hadn't realized how much the atmosphere around him mirrored the one inside his mind. The dusty corners, the untouched shelves, the closed doors. They were all reflections of things he hadn't wanted to look at in himself. That evening, instead of turning on the news like he usually did, Harold lit a candle and played soft piano music on the old radio in the kitchen. The usual voices of panic and politics were replaced by something quieter. The flicker of the candle. The steady rhythm of breath. For the first time in a long while, the house didn't feel haunted. It felt held. Harold understood then that healing wasn't always about doing something big. Sometimes it was as simple as choosing silence over noise, presence over avoidance. By clearing out the things he no longer needed, he had made space for stillness, for peace, and maybe even for something new to grow. The house hadn't changed much, but somehow it no longer felt like a museum of what was lost. It was becoming a home again, a place where memory could live, but no longer rule. Part 3. Let it flow. It happened on a quiet evening in late October. The sky outside was the color of ash, the wind threading through the trees like an old song. Harold had just finished folding laundry, a habit he clung to more for rhythm than necessity, when he caught sight of Ellie's old robe hanging behind the door. He had meant to donate it during his recent cleaning spree, but something had made him hesitate. That evening, it felt heavier than cloth. It felt like memory draped in cotton. He took it down and held it for a long while, unsure why the ache in his chest felt sharper than usual. Maybe it was the way the house smelled, roasted vegetables and rosemary, the dinner Ellie used to make on cool evenings. Maybe it was just that some silences are louder than others. That night, Harold dreamed of her, not vividly, just a glimpse. She stood across a field, sunlight in her hair, saying nothing. But her smile, it undid him. He woke before dawn, the ache curling in his stomach like smoke. The grief wasn't new, but this time, it didn't arrive like a storm. It came softly, and for the first time, Harold didn't try to push it away. He didn't brace against it, or question why it was back after all these months. He just sat there in bed, his hands resting in his lap, letting the tears come and go as they pleased. Later that morning, he walked to the garden behind the house, Ellie's old watering can in hand. He hadn't used it in months. The frost was beginning to settle in, but the rosemary bush still held on. He sat down on the stone bench they had placed there years ago, and slowly he pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. The letter had taken him days to write. It wasn't polished or poetic. It was simple, honest. A letter to Ellie, filled with all the words he hadn't spoken, all the things he now knew he couldn't change. Harold read it aloud under his breath, not expecting answers, just release. Then, with shaking hands, he struck a match and lit the corner of the page. He watched as the flame curled through his handwriting, eating through regret, line by line, until only ash remained. The smoke rose, gentle and blue, vanishing into the morning air. Something loosened in him. Grief, he realized, doesn't ask to be fixed. It only asks to be honored. He had spent so long gripping every thought, every memory, afraid that letting go would mean forgetting. But now, he saw it differently. Letting go didn't erase the love. It simply stopped the suffering. Ellie didn't live in the ache. She lived in the garden, in the breeze, in the morning sun on his skin. As he stood and brushed the ash from his lap, Harold felt a strange clarity, like something had flowed through him and out. Not gone, not forgotten, just no longer weighing him down. That morning, he didn't walk away from grief. He walked with it, lighter somehow and finally free to keep going. Part 4. A moment of stillness. A week later, Harold found himself standing awkwardly in the corner of the local library's community room, eyeing a circle of chairs and strangers. His granddaughter, Lily, had been the one to convince him to come. "It's just a meditation group, Grandpa. No incense or chanting, just breathing." She had smiled, squeezed his hand. It might help. He wasn't so sure. Harold had always considered himself more practical than spiritual. He liked things he could measure, fix, build. Breathing, he thought, came naturally. What more was there to learn? But something in Lily's voice had stayed with him. A softness. A hope. And so here he was, 72, retired, and sitting in a folding chair between a teenage boy in a hoodie and a woman knitting quietly in her lap. The facilitator, a woman named Maya, spoke gently, guiding the room into stillness. "You don't need to control your breath," she said. "Just notice it. Let your body do what it knows how to do. Let your mind wander if it needs to, and when you notice that wandering, gently return to the breath." Harold closed his eyes. At first, all he could hear was noise, the creak of chairs, a cough, the hum of fluorescent lights, and under it all, the familiar chaos of thought. His mind drifted from his to-do list to old memories, then to nothing at all, then back to Ellie. But somewhere in the quiet, something subtle shifted. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't find enlightenment, but he did notice something. His breath, the slow rhythmic in and out, the way his chest rose and fell like a tide. For the first time, he wasn't chasing his thoughts. He was watching them come and go. There was no judgment, no effort to push them away, just presence, just breath. When Maya rang a soft bell to end the session, Harold stayed still for a moment longer. His eyes fluttered open, and the room looked the same. But it felt different. Lighter. Like someone had cracked open a window he hadn't realized was shut. He didn't feel transformed, but he felt here. Driving home later, he didn't turn on the radio. He let the silence ride with him. Not the old kind of silence, the heavy, hollow kind that echoed with loss, but a quieter, fuller kind, the kind that made space instead of taking it. That night, Harold sat on the porch again. No journal, no plans, just him and the evening breeze. He watched the sky change color and followed his breath without thinking. It was the simplest thing, just being there, fully. For once, the world didn't ask anything of him, and he didn't ask anything of it. In that stillness, something settled. Not everything was solved. Not everything was easy. But for a few precious minutes, Harold's mind wasn't a battlefield. It was a garden, quiet, alive, and at last, still. Part 5. Gratitude Letters. It was an early November morning when Harold slipped on the back step and landed hard on his side. Nothing broke, thankfully, but the fall left him sore enough to spend the next few days moving slower, with a cane and a wince. At first he was frustrated. He had been feeling better lately, lighter in his mind, steadier in his heart, and now here he was, grounded by something as ordinary as a patch of wet leaves. But by the third day of sitting still, Harold began to notice something. The quiet no longer scared him. It invited him. He started each morning at the kitchen table with a cup of tea instead of coffee. The bitter edge of caffeine had lost its comfort. One morning, staring at the steam rising from his mug, he reached for a pen and pulled a sheet of paper from the drawer. Without thinking, he wrote, "Dear Ellie, thank you." The words came easy. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for never laughing when I forgot the milk. Thank you for loving the version of me I couldn't always see. It was the first letter. He didn't stop there. The next day he wrote to his son, "Thank you for the hard conversations. Thank you for showing up even when I was difficult to reach." Then to a neighbor who always waved, even when Harold forgot to wave back. To his brother, long gone now, whose silence after a childhood fight had lasted until death, but whose kindness as boys still lived in Harold's bones. With each letter, something changed. It wasn't grand. It didn't erase grief or regret. But it rewired the way Harold saw the people who had shaped his life, and, perhaps more importantly, how he saw himself. He realized that even in his flaws, even in his missteps, he had been loved, and in turn, he had loved. Not perfectly, not always visibly, but consistently. One afternoon, he mailed a letter to the widow of an old army friend. They hadn't spoken in decades. He simply wrote, "Your husband once sat with me all night in a muddy trench while I cried. He didn't say a word, but I've never forgotten that kindness." A week later, he received a reply. Handwritten. "I read your letter aloud to our children. Thank you for giving them a piece of their father we never knew." Harold held that note for a long time, his fingers trembling not from age, but from something closer to awe. Gratitude, he realized, wasn't just a feeling. It was a bridge. A way back to the parts of life that still lived in him, even when the people didn't. Each letter became a soft light in the corners of his memory, turning shadows into warmth. And slowly, quietly, the heaviness that had lived in his chest since Ellie passed began to shift. It didn't disappear, but it shared space now, with grace, with memory, and most of all, with thanks. Part 6. A Garden in the Mind. The first daffodils had just broken through the earth when Harold realized the seasons had changed. He stood in the backyard, cane still in hand, looking over the patch of soil where Ellie's garden used to bloom. For months after she passed, he had let it go wild. Weeds took root where her tulips once lined the walkway. The soil cracked in places she used to kneel. He hadn't touched it since the funeral. He couldn't. But something in him had softened. And that morning, with sleeves rolled up and knees aching, he began to tend it again. He didn't plant anything new, not yet. He just cleared space, pulled weeds, turned the soil, smoothed the edges. There was something deeply familiar about the rhythm. Ellie used to hum as she worked, and though the tune was long forgotten, he could still feel it in the breeze. As he moved through the garden, his breath matched the earth's quiet exhale. It wasn't just a yard anymore. It was a mirror. Later that week, Lily came to visit. She sat with him on the back porch, her feet tucked beneath her on the swing. The air smelled of fresh soil in early spring. They spoke about nothing in particular. Weather, recipes, a neighbor's new dog, until she looked at him and said, "You seem different, Grandpa. Calmer. Like you're not carrying so much." Harold smiled and nodded, though he wasn't sure how to put it into words. He wasn't healed, not in the way people often mean. Ellie's absence still carved space in his days. Regret still visited him sometimes in the quiet. But his relationship to those feelings had changed. They were no longer burdens. They were companions. Gentle reminders of a life fully lived, not fully controlled. He glanced at the garden, now neatly framed and ready for planting. "You know," he said slowly, "I used to think peace was something you found, out there, in a book or a retreat or some secret way of thinking, but I think it's more like a garden. You clear a little space inside yourself, plant something small, like patience or kindness, and you just keep tending to it, even when you don't see anything growing yet." Lily smiled and reached for his hand. That evening, Harold sat alone once more, watching the last light fade behind the trees. The house was still, the way it had always been since Ellie left. But it no longer felt empty. It felt full, in the quiet, in the breath, in the garden beginning again. His thoughts still came, of course, some old, some new. But he had learned not to grip them so tightly. He let them rise and fall like wind through leaves, and for the first time in a long, long while, Harold felt at home. not just in his house, but in his mind. The wind carried the scent of rain that evening as Harold stood at the kitchen window, watching clouds gather above the hills. The world outside seemed poised for a storm, but inside, all was still. He turned off the kettle before it whistled, poured hot water over a tea bag, and returned to the porch with both hands wrapped around the mug. The warmth in his palms reminded him of something simple but essential. He was here, present, breathing, alive. The journey hadn't been grand or dramatic. There had been no one moment when everything changed, no loud breakthrough or lightning bolt of wisdom, just small steps, a morning on the porch, a box of old ornaments, a letter set aflame in the garden, a moment of breath in a quiet room. Over. Time. Those small choices became something larger, something steady. They became a way of living. Harold had not conquered his mind. He hadn't rid himself of sorrow or silenced every thought. But what he had found was more enduring. A relationship. With his own heart that no longer felt like a war, he had come to see that peace was never about escaping the noise. It was about learning how to listen to it differently, to see his thoughts not as enemies but as passing weather, not as truths, but as visitors. Some welcome, some not. All impermanent. He thought often now of Ellie, not just in her absence, but in the way her presence lingered in small things. The rosemary bush in the back garden, the soft hum of the wind chimes, the quiet knowing that he had loved and been loved, and that love didn't vanish when the person did. It changed form, but it remained. Harold had begun planting again, not just in the soil, but in himself. Kindness toward his own thoughts. Patience with his slower steps. Gratitude for mornings that came without the heaviness they once carried. There were days when it was harder. Grief doesn't follow a straight line, but he no longer measured progress by how much pain he felt. He measured it by how willing he was to stay, to breathe, to witness it all with compassion. If you've ever woken in the middle of the night, overwhelmed by a mind that won't rest, Harold's story is not a prescription. It's a companion. A quiet reminder that there is no rush to fix what hurts. Sometimes the most healing thing we can do is sit beside our thoughts like old friends, offer them a chair, and let them speak without fear. Peace doesn't come all at once, but it comes. In the stillness, in the breath, in the simple choice to begin again each day. And if this story has given you even a little comfort, a small pause in your own busy mind, then perhaps it has done its work. If you feel called to share your thoughts, to reflect, or to return to this space when needed, you are warmly invited to do so. And if you'd like to continue walking this path of gentle discovery with us, consider subscribing or sharing this with someone who may need it. Because somewhere out there, someone else is sitting in silence, wondering if peace is still possible. And perhaps today, that answer is yes.